We're going to try to keep on schedule and switch gears to hearing from Matt Kornis with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Great Lakes Mass Marking Program, covering the growing amount of data coming in from coded wire tags on a variety of fish species.
All right, well, thanks everybody for tuning in tonight. Thanks for the introduction, Dan. I'm a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Services Mass Marking Program, and I'm just going to go through some study results we have after a brief program overview. So to just give you a kind of heads up on where we're going today, I've got that program overview, just kind of basic knowledge about our program, and then highlighting some of the work we are doing on Chinook salmon, lake trout, and steelhead in both Lakes Michigan and Huron. So without further ado, our program is a collaboration among federal, state, and tribal agencies. It's coordinated by the Fish and Wildlife Service out of our Green Bay office. Our program began in 2010 to address questions on survival and contribution of hatchery fish, natural reproduction, movement, growth, and other measures for salmon and trout. We are funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is through the Environmental Protection Agency. And it's really thanks to your support and support of anglers like you that we have 11 years of data at this point on over 160,000 fish from open water angling, which gives us a lot of data and analytical power to get at some of these questions that are really important, not only to you, but to our state and tribal partners and managers around the lake. Our program is comprised of four main parts. We have the tagging and marking of hatchery fish, the data collection and recovery of tags from the sport fishery, tag extraction, aging of wild fish, and other lab activities, and data analysis and support for fisheries managers. A brief summary of our tagging efforts. We utilize autofish trailers, which are capable of processing between 7,000 and 10,000 fish every hour, to adipose fin clip and coated wire tag fish that are raised at state and federal hatcheries and released into Lake Michigan and the U.S. waters of Lake Huron. This figure shows the number of fish marked in millions over time. You can see the three main species we've worked on over this time period are lake trout in green, Chinook salmon in blue, and steelhead in pink. This last season, 2023, we marked and or tagged about 10 million fish in total, about evenly split between lake trout, Chinook salmon, and steelhead. For our recovery operation, we've operated this field survey since 2012. It's an extensive survey to collect tags and biodata from adult fish, not only these hatchery and tagged fish, but also from wild fish. We have 6 different teams. They are stationed at the black stars on this map at the right, and they sample 35 to 40 ports every year. Those are indicated by the red circles on this map at the right. And for we usually get between 12 and 15,000 fish a year. Last year, we observed 13,397 fish over the course of our summer survey. This is one of the most abundant sources samples for many species, and this allows us to collaborate on a number of studies, including the diet work we'll be hearing about a little later today. The third main component of our operation is in the lab. So these coated wire tags, even though we have fancy auto machines to tag them into the fish, we do have to extract them by hand. You can see a picture of that happening here. And through 2023, we've recovered over 145,000 of these coated wire tags, not only from our sport fish survey, but from bottom set gillnet independent, fishery independent surveys, commercial fisheries, voluntary angler returns, and state creel and weir surveys. So we work on tags from a lot of different projects. We also estimate the ages of wild fish using scales, otoliths, or maxillae. That kind of works somewhat like counting rings on a tree. I've got a very nice cherry-picked picture here of an otolith to kind of show you how that works, but many of these samples are a lot more challenging to interpret. In this past year, we were able to get estimates on 3,500 fish, including Chinook, steelhead, and lake trout. And then the fourth component of our program is data analysis and support for management. To just give you a brief overview of that, the coded wire tags have helped to answer questions about wild recruitment, movement, survival patterns, and growth rates in Chinook salmon, lake trout, and steelhead. Our data are used in several models that are used by managers to inform policy decisions on stocking and harvest regulations. And then because we're able to get our hands on so many fish, we've been able to leverage the field survey to collaborate on studies, including that of sea lamprey wounding on salmon and trout diets, which we'll hear from in the next talk. The natal origin of wild steelhead, Chinook salmon, and coho salmon. In other words, where do the wild fish of these species come from? Genetic composition of wild lake trout, and the contamination of PFAS chemicals in the sport fishery. Real quick here in terms of some future plans. This year, 2024, is the final year for steelhead tagging in our program. The funds used for steelhead are going to start being used to tag coho salmon with a study plan that's underway to start tagging next year in 2025. All right, so moving right along here to some of our results from Chinook salmon. First, I want to talk about Chinook salmon movement. One of the main findings from our program, and if you've seen any of my talks, this has been a component of this almost since day one. We've observed that Chinook salmon movement is pretty much unconstrained most of the year, the exception being spawning when they do return to where they were stocked, or in the case of wild fish where they were hatched to spawn. And so the evidence for this, these are just two example maps. The map on the left shows all the Chinook salmon that we've seen landed in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. So that star on the map is where all of these Chinook salmon were landed, and the circles are proportional in size to the catch per effort there. So you can see that anglers out of Manitowoc are landing Chinook salmon from all over the lake, as well as northern Lake Huron, which is where all of the Chinook and Lake Huron are stocked at present. And this pattern is similar on both sides of the lake. The map on the right is for Chinook salmon landed in Frankfort, Michigan. One thing we've seen in terms of these Chinook that are stocked in Lake Huron is that the vast majority of our observations on Chinook stocked in Lake Huron actually occur in Lake Michigan. So 94% of the Chinook salmon that we've observed that were stocked in Lake Huron, we actually observed those in Lake Michigan, with only 0.2% of the Chinook stocked in Lake Michigan observed in Huron. So it's very much kind of a one-way ticket. But we do see a breakdown between the feeding and the spawning season. So the two maps you see here show the relative abundance of Chinook salmon stocked in Lake Huron. The map on the left shows the patterns during April through July, when we believe the predominant movements are related to finding alewife to feed. You can see most of those Chinook are popping up in Lake Michigan. By the time we get to August and September on the right, we see those Lake Huron stocked Chinook are most commonly found right there in northern Lake Huron, where they were stocked. Another thing we look at for Chinook salmon is wild production. We do this by looking at the ratio of wild to hatchery fish. We found that the age that is least biased to do this at is at age 2. This is because sometimes age 1 fish are a little small. We don't see them in our anglers catch that as often because of the smaller size. And wild fish do tend to be smaller than hatchery fish. And so by the time we get to age 2, we're not really concerned about a size bias for against wild fish. Of course, the 2020 year class was largely not marked due to COVID-19. So this had created some challenges for estimating the wild production from that year class. And it's unknown. And in the case of how we handled this in the modeling, we basically estimated it from adjacent years. So basically, we measure our observation as the percent of wild fish in various statistical districts in the lake. We then use that percentage to determine how many wild fish must have been present alongside the known number of stocked fish to produce that percentage that we observed. So what we see in this figure is our estimates of the number of Chinook salmon smolts in millions by year class in Lake Michigan. The stocked smolts, which is a known number, those are in orange. Our estimate for wild smolt production is in blue. You can see here that the value for 2020 is kind of a lighter shade. That's because this is not based on observations, but is based on an average of these 3 year classes. And again, that's because we can't differentiate hatchery from wild fish from 2020 because they were not marked. And then the 2022 year class is also in a shaded color. That's because this estimate was conducted at age 1. We won't be able to get the final number for these fish until they are 2-year-olds in this summer survey in 2024. So that is kind of our first estimate, and that will change next year. So if you look at the most recent year classes, we saw in 2021 8.6 million wild fish for a total of almost 12 million. And then 5.7 million wild fish from the 2022 year class for a total of about 8.6 million. Some patterns that we've noticed, if you kind of look at the pattern just for the wild smolts, if we pull out the known number of stocked smolts, we see 3 kind of prevailing patterns here. We have the 26 through 2012 year classes where wild production ranged from 6 to 8 million every year. Then we have the 2013 year class, which was our historic low in this time series. That was a year class where half the lake was in drought during the spawning season that prevented access for spawning adult Chinook salmon to reach the spawning grounds. So that reduced wild recruitment. On top of that, that was followed by a really delayed spring. That winter from 2013 to 2014 was the winter of the polar vortex. It was the winter I moved back to Wisconsin from Maryland, and I remember we didn't have leaves on the trees until almost Memorial Day. So take that for what you will, but then we had several subsequent year classes that were likely affected by the reduced amount of wild fish. We got between 3 to 5 million wild estimates per year. But for the last 4 year classes, we have been back in that 6 to 8 million wild fish estimate range. And so we do kind of see a bit of a bounce back there in this time series. We've also done work on Chinook salmon survival. I only have one slide as I don't have a ton of time to go into all of the details, but this is a map that's coming out in a paper we're submitting sometime soon from a research intern in our office named Brooks Harp. The review of the main findings here is we generally saw a high relative survival indicated by these deep red colors on the Wisconsin shoreline and Lake Michigan, really low survival indicated by these kind of pale yellow colors in Green Bay and MM6. And then moderate survival everywhere else, including those fish stocked in northern Lake Huron. We also saw that relative survival of stocked fish generally decreased from the 2011 through 2016 year classes. It's possible that that is related to declining patterns in alewife abundance over that time, although the correlations there aren't as strong as maybe we would think they would be, but there might be something there. All right. We also work a lot on lake trout. So in terms of things we look at for lake trout, one of the main things we do every year is to estimate relative abundance of wild fish. We calculate this as the number of fish observed per sampling day, and this is actually the measure we use for relative abundance for all of our species. I'm just mentioning it here as we go through for lake trout. And in order to kind of simplify the patterns, we grouped everything into 3 large regions. So we have southern Lake Michigan. Throughout the next several slides, this will be in navy blue, and that includes 8 sampled statistical districts. We have northern Lake Michigan, which is light blue, and that will be 5 sample districts. And then Lake Huron, we have 5 sample districts in orange colors. In order to look at this, we only used values from the statistical districts that had at least 20 lake trout observed. And then we averaged values from those districts with at least 20 fish to get a value for the region. Most of these regions had far more than 20 fish, but that was our cutoff. And in northern Lake Michigan in particular, we sometimes failed to meet that. We're not reporting the percentage of wild lake trout. We're phasing that out in part because stocking changes over the last decade has affected the catch of hatchery lake trout, and that can lead to higher percentages of wild fish that doesn't necessarily reflect wild production. So in terms of our summary slide for wild lake trout relative abundance, that's what we're seeing in this slide over time. We can see that wild lake trout in Lake Huron, the trend has been overwhelmingly positive from 2012 through 2023. Likewise, in southern Lake Michigan, we have seen a general increasing trend in the abundance of wild lake trout. Northern Lake Michigan, we did not see very many wild lake trout at all until 2021. And then in 2021 and 2022, we saw some higher numbers than we had previously, but this past year, that number came back down, at least in the sport fishery observations. So to give you some sense of lake trout on the whole, I'm going to focus on each of these three regions and show hatchery lake trout in orange, wild lake trout in gray, and then the total in black. So this is our data from the sport fishery in Lake Huron. We can see that the catch of hatchery lake trout went down from after 2012 and then has been more or less consistent. And as a result of that, the catch patterns for all lake trout in black are really driven by the catch of the wild lake trout, given that constant value for hatchery lake trout. In southern Lake Michigan, we actually see opposing patterns for wild and hatchery lake trout. We can see the gray line here, those wild lake trout with that positive trend. Hatchery lake trout, we really saw a declining trend in the catch starting in 2016. And the total catch in lake trout has largely reflected that up until the last year or two when it started to pick up the wild signal a bit more. Now, if you look at this hatchery lake trout pattern, I want to put this in the context of stocking decisions. This is a figure showing the number of lake trout, the yearling equivalents of lake trout that have been stocked in southern Lake Michigan waters outside of the southern refuge. And we're excluding the refuge here because our data are from the sport fishery, and the sport fishery does not occur in the refuge waters. We see that we start seeing kind of the most abundant year age-wise in our catch is 5-year-old fish. So if we take the hatchery lake trout pattern here and we offset that by 5 years, we can get a sense of when those fish were stocked. And here is our hatchery lake trout pattern offset by 5 years, overlaid onto this stocking pattern. So while you can see it's not a perfect relationship, starting here with that decline from the 2011 year class to the 2018 year class, that's corresponding with the 2016 observations through 2023. We do see fairly close alignment here. And so this decline in hatchery catch is more or less explained by the stocking patterns. In northern Lake Michigan, I mentioned earlier that in some of the statistical districts, we don't have that minimum number of 20 fish. We actually, that varies by year. Some years we have that in some districts, and some years we don't. And that's unfortunately produced this kind of jagged total and hatchery lake trout pattern here. You know, we don't really have a clear pattern here on hatchery lake trout, but we do see in wild lake trout, again, that kind of modest increase with a tailing off here in the last year. So what we've seen is a continued rise in wild abundance in southern Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, but a stall in that trend in northern Lake Michigan. In terms of lake trout movement, the dispersal range is a lot more limited compared to Chinook salmon. We know it's limited to about 100 kilometers or 62 miles. We've looked at this for stocking units all over. I just have two examples here. This map at the left shows lake trout stocked in Indiana. The percentage values represent the percent of the catch per effort of fish stocked there. So you can see the majority of those lake trout are actually harvested in Indiana. And then the vast majority are occurring in adjacent units. Likewise, if we look in Lake Huron, this map at the right shows lake trout that were stocked in MH2. And we can see here that most of those lake trout were recovered in MH1, 2, and 3. Another thing we've noticed from our observations, though, is that the offshore stocking sites for lake trout actually have more movement than the nearshore sites. And as a result of that, we do see offshore stocking sites as a source for nearshore areas in Lake Michigan. This map at the right, on the left, looks at the percentage of fish recovered in each district that originated from the Northern Refuge. Those red values are all 14% or higher. On the right, we see the percentage of fish recovered in each district that originated at the Southern Refuge, which is highlighted here in yellow. And so between these two refuges, we do see in Lake Michigan a large contribution of fish from these offshore sites in the nearshore sport fishery. This is in part because of how many fish are stocked there, but it's also in part because of evidence of higher relative survival. So We estimate relative survival by looking at the return rate. That's the catch per effort per number of fish stocked. Our blue units here are Julian's Reef, which is navy and on the map in the lower left corner. The Southern Refuge in kind of light blue, and the Northern Refuge in gray blue. And we do see our highest survival rates from lake trout that are stocked on Julian's Reef and the Southern Refuge. Likewise, if we look at the nearshore stocking units, those are more warm in color. We saw comparable survival for fish stocked in the Northern Refuge compared to the south and east nearshore waters. But fish that were stocked in western waters, mostly off the Wisconsin shoreline nearshore, really didn't survive all that well. We have also looked at lake trout relative survival in Lake Huron, at least in a preliminary sense. These are data from the 2010 to 2012 year classes. And in this case, the colors on this figure correspond with the colors on the map. We did see high relative survival for lake trout that were stocked at 3 sites near Bois Blanc. And we can see that kind of highlighted. If I move my mouse over here, we can see that region up here. We also saw fish that were stocked at South Point and Ensemble Point surviving relatively well. If we look at Goose Island Shoal and Drummond Island, these 2 sites along the northern coast had the lowest relative survival from our recoveries. I want to point out that among these sites, Drummond Island is pretty far from where most of the sport fishery is occurring, just because of it being offshore and generally away from population centers. So that's likely contributing to the low catch of fish stock there. On top of that, a telemetry study recently found that mature lake trout are migrating east off of Drummond Island, predominantly into Canadian waters post-spawning. So if that is in fact the predominant direction of trout after they utilize Drummond Island for spawning, those fish are not coming into where we would see them in our sport fishery. So we think that's what's going on with Drummond Island. For Goose Island Shoal, I really have no explanation for that pattern. Other than we do seem to see relatively lower survival for fish stock there. All right, in the 10 minutes I have left, I want to talk about steelhead. Steelhead's the most recent fish that we've looked at with the coded wire tagging study. Most of the results I'll be showing you here have the preliminary moniker in bold red. That's because this study won't be concluded probably until 2028. Most of the recoveries of steelhead we get occur at age 2, 3, and 4. Because COVID interrupted our tagging of steelhead, we did extend the tagging up until this year. I actually think our operator is likely finished or will finish tagging those steelhead this fall. But we won't get the final data on those fish until they are, age 3 and 4-year-olds in 2027 and 28. But with what we've learned so far, we did start tagging these things in 2017. So we do have a lot of good preliminary information. One thing we've seen is that there are 5 different genetic strains stocked in Lake Michigan waters, and that their average length of age does vary by strain. We see Ganaraska here in gray has a smaller length of age than many of the other strains. And so by comparison here, if you look at age 2, the average length for Ganaraska, that's about 450 millimeters. That's about 18 inches. By comparison, the Skamania and the Arlee strains are about 575 millimeters. That equates to roughly 4 inches larger. And so we can see our mean length at age 2, that's 18 to 23 inches. By the time we get to age 3, we do see those Ganaraskas catching up a little bit. They're still a little bit smaller, but now we're at 24 to 28 inches for those 3-year-old fish on average. Obviously, there's a lot of variability around this, but that's what we see in terms of our strain differences. Like Chinook salmon, we do look to estimate wild production using the known number of stocked fish and the proportion of wild fish. Overall, the percentage of wild fish in Lake Michigan ranged from 40 to 50% for the 2017 through 2019 year classes. For the 2021 year class, we only saw about 21% wild, but we do expect this to increase when we start seeing age 3 fish next year. And that's why I preface this with this growth slide. Based on our work with Chinook salmon, we know that 20 inches more or less is about the cutoff after which we stop expecting to see bias against the harvest of those fish. And so, we can see that some of these stocked fish are a little less than that, but wild fish are even less still. And because of that discrepancy, we do expect that this will rise. We did look at the percent of wild fish at ages 2, 3, and 4 for the 2019 year class, and we did see that increase with age. So that's part of that as well. So overall, these are actually consistent with a independent study using otolith microchemistry that estimated about 40% of wild fish in Lake Michigan to be wild, and that's right in range with what we've been observing with the coated wire tags. So steelhead stocking in Lake Michigan has been fairly consistent since we started doing this. So the only variability we see in this figure is in the wild smolts in blue. So you can see that there is some range here. Right now, the biggest difference is that 2021 year class, but again, that's the year class that we aren't really confident in our estimate in, just because we are looking at that at age 2 recoveries. For movement of steelhead, we've seen that they are similar to Chinook salmon in that they are largely unconstrained in their movements during spawning. This is a figure showing the recoveries of steelhead stocked in Indiana. The circles are proportional to the catch per the catch per effort in the sport fishery, and we can see that those Indiana steelhead are being caught lake-wide. One exception, though, is unlike Chinook salmon, we do see a lot less movement between Lakes Huron and Michigan. So we only see about 24% of the steelhead stocked in Huron. We only see about 24% of those observed in Lake Michigan. The other 3/4 are actually still observed in Lake Huron. Part of that might be that their diets are a little more plastic. When steelhead aren't able to find alewife, they do seem to consume a lot more invertebrates, especially terrestrial invertebrates. And so that's likely why we see this pattern where they're just able to kind of alter their diets just a little bit in Lake Huron, where we see less alewife. We're also looking at developing charts for each management unit to show the composition of the catch. This is just an example pie chart of steelhead that were landed in WM5. That's the unit near Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we can see here that steelhead landed there are coming from all of the states and including steelhead stocked in Lakes Huron. In terms of relative survival, we've noticed that the average relative survival is about 3 times higher for yearlings and fingerlings. So fingerlings are about 20 to 25% of steelhead stocked, but only 4 to 7% of the harvest. So we to look at other patterns in relative survival, we have only looked at yearlings. These are our patterns in Lake Michigan. We have 3 major groups. If we transfer the red, blue, and yellow colors spatially, we end up with this map here at the left, where we see relatively high survival in southern and northern Lake Michigan, as well as the small tributaries in Wisconsin. Those are stocked all along the coast. Moderate survival kind of in central Lake Michigan, and then really low survival in Green Bay. And then just for reference, this map at the right shows where these steelhead are stocked with circle size corresponding to stocking numbers. We've also taken a look at relative survival in Lake Huron. So far, we've seen a noticeable pattern with a relatively high survival from this 2017 year class. We don't see a strong location pattern because this particular tag lot was stocked pretty much throughout Lake Huron, at least all the way down to the southern tip of Saginaw Bay. We have seen relatively low survival from this 2018 year class fish stocked at Port Sanilac and Lexington Harbor. These 2 bars, I wouldn't think that these are necessarily close to significant patterns, but they are kind of borderline. The units here are standard deviations of the mean. And so those blue lines at 1 and -1 represent kind of our cutoffs here for lack of having statistical analysis at this point. But we do see comparable patterns here where, again, this green unit where we saw relatively high survival, it's MH1, 2, and 3, whereas this relatively low survival was MH4 and MH6 down in the south. And then we saw a whole bunch of stuff in the middle where we really don't have much of a pattern here in terms of survival. These were kind of our moderate survival zones. So some preliminary conclusions for steelhead. All the states are depending on each other's steelhead. We saw poor survival in Green Bay, similar to Chinook salmon, relatively good survival in southern and northern Lake Michigan, as well as northern Lake Huron and the Wisconsin small tributaries. And as I said, some preliminary survival patterns are emerging in Huron. The jury is still out on strain differences. We're kind of waiting until we get all the data in from all these year classes. We're going to need the sample size to tease out any survival patterns and strain, just because we have to account for stocking location differences to really look at that. Our next steps are going to be continuing to look at this as we get the data rolling in through 2028. Exploring strain-specific staging patterns for spawning-related movements, and to look at the seasonality and the catch rates of different units. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Matt.